Guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren, oder besser gesagt, viele warme Grüße zum Nikolaustag. Ich heiße Sankt Nikolaus. Professor Frem hat mich in die 17. Lektion eingeladen, um den 6. September mit Ihnen zu feiern. Nun, was ist der 6. Dezember? Alle Kinder in Deutschland wissen, dass der 6. Dezember der Nikolaustag ist. Und jetzt möchte ich Ihnen ein Weihnachtslied beibringen. Das Lied ist sehr schön. Es heißt Kling, Glöckchen. Kling, Glöckchen, klingelingeling, kling, Glöckchen, kling. Lass mich ein, ihr Kinder, ist so kalt der Winter, öffnet mir die Türen, lass mich nicht erfrieren. Kling, Glöckchen, klingelingeling, kling, Glöckchen, kling. Dankeschön, Dankeschön. Also dann, wie ich schon gesagt habe, mein Name ist Sankt Nikolaus. Jedes Jahr am 6. Dezember besuche ich die Kinder in Deutschland. Ich schenke den braven Kindern Süßigkeiten und Spielzeuge. Aber die bösen Kinder bekommen eine Rute. Also dann, und was habe ich denn für Sie im Sack? Zum Nikolaustag bekommen Sie Kenntnisse von der deutschen Sprache. Schauen Sie. In dieser Lektion lernen Sie mehr Infinitivsätze und Sie lernen den Dativ. Das ist aufregend. Nun, meine Zeit ist leider um. Ihr Professor ist gleich wieder da, aber ich wünsche Ihnen viel Spaß und viel Erfolg und alles Gute zum Nikolaustag. Guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren, ich bin wieder da. I hope you enjoyed our opening guest. Oh, and by the way, I did inform Herr Sankt Nikolaus that we've all been very nice this year. I said to him, dieses Jahr sind wir sehr brav gewesen. Speaking of St. Nikolaus, let's take a closer look at a few things that he said in his opening address. It turns out, surprise, surprise, that St. Nikolaus used several of the grammatical forms that we're going to cover in this lesson. For example, he told us, Professor Frem hat mich in die 17. Lektion eingeladen, um den 6. Dezember mit Ihnen zu feiern. This utterance is made up of two clauses. A main clause, Professor Frem hat mich in die 17. Lektion eingeladen, and a dependent clause, um den 6. Dezember mit Ihnen zu feiern. We're going to take a look at a particular construction in the dependent clause, which is actually an infinitive dependent clause, and which contains the particles and zu. More specifically, this formulation is written as zu. And yes, these dots are important. They indicate that other words come in between the two particles. And we see this when St. Nicholas tells us, den 6. Dezember mit Ihnen zu feiern. The dependent clause here is headed up by the preposition which in English we translate as in order. After the comes all the extra info about the action, the direct object, and the manner element, followed by the zu infinitive, which marks the end of the clause. In short, this is how we formulate infinitive dependent clauses in German with the zu infinitive. Now, maybe you're thinking, wait, didn't we just learn in the last lesson how to formulate infinitive clauses using the preposition zu? Why do we need to learn this zu business? Well, that's a fair question. So let me show you why. Consider the following two utterances, both with a main clause and a dependent infinitive clause. Es ist wichtig, ein zuverlässiges Auto zu haben. And ich brauche Geld, ein zuverlässiges Auto zu kaufen. Now, the first utterance doesn't need the In fact, if you put the in there, it would translate to the awkward sounding, it's important in order to have a reliable car. The second utterance, though, sounds completely fine when we put in the I need money in order to buy a reliable car. And so this is the main takeaway. The most useful way to determine whether you need an zu in your infinitive dependent clause, or whether you can get by with only a zu, is to see if the English translation in order to works. If it does work, well, you need to use zu. And if it doesn't work, all you need is the zu. Now, unfortunately, there's a syntactic quirk of English that ever so slightly complicates this strategy. English, you see, has a tendency to leave off the in order part and just go with to, even when in order to works just fine. So imagine that, St. Nicolaus shows up at a house with a bundle of switches for the unfortunate, naughty kids. And he announces this: Ich bin gekommen, den bösen Kindern Routen zu geben. Now, in English, there are actually two ways we could translate this. We could say, I've come in order to give the naughty children switches. Or we can just drop the in order and say, I've come to give the naughty children switches. Both translations are fine in English, but in German, you see, the only grammatically allowable way to construct this dependent sentence is with an zu infinitive. Alles klar? Gut. And now that we've seen how zu works, there are two more infinitive constructions that we need to cover. Both are widely used and very useful in everyday language. And these are ohne zu and statt zu. For example, let's imagine that St. Nicolaus comes to your house and announces this: Statt euch Geschenke zu schenken, bekommt ihr Routen zum Nikolaustag. Oh je, meine Damen und Herren, das ist schlimm. But as we can see, constructions with statt zu unfold exactly like zu. The clause is bookended with statt at the beginning and the zu infinitive at the end. And the rest of the words come in the middle. Our next infinitive construction, ohne zu, follows the same pattern. Imagine this situation. We've just had to tell some upsetting news to a friend. The news is so upsetting, in fact, that our friend left the house without saying a word. Well, in German we would say, Mein Freund hat das Haus verlassen, ohne ein einziges Wort zu sagen. As we can see, ohne zu works the exact same as zu and statt zu. Und das ist alles. I hope you agree when I say that really it's not that difficult. It just takes some practice and, of course, a good guide along the way. Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, it's now time to pivot our attention away from infinitive clauses. Because, as St. Nicolaus foretold at the start of our lesson, we have a new grammatical case to learn, namely, the dative. And in fact, St. Nicolaus himself made use of the dative case in his own speech. Zum Beispiel, when he told us the following about his job. Ich schenke den braven Kindern Süßigkeiten und Spielzeuge. Now, meine Damen und Herren, this is what I call a grammatically gorgeous utterance. I call it that because, one, I'm a grammar geek, and two, it contains three different grammatical cases. There's a nominative subject, an accusative direct object, and then there's a third player in this grammatical setup. Namely, there is a person to whom the subject ich is giving the direct objects Süßigkeiten and Spielzeuge. This third-party recipient of the action is known as the indirect object. Here, the indirect object is den braven Kindern. And in German, indirect objects are expressed with the dative case. Another way to think about the dative case is that it answers the question, to whom or for whom. In fact, there are similar questions that we can use to determine if parts of a sentence are in the nominative or accusative case. To ascertain the subject, for instance, we can ask, who or what is doing something? And to ascertain the direct object, we can ask, who or what is the subject directly acting on through the verb? But tell you what, let's take a look at one more example of an utterance that contains all three grammatical cases, and we'll ask these questions to ascertain each case. Alles klar? Recall that right before St. Nikolaus sang that lovely Christmas tune for us, he said this: Und jetzt möchte ich Ihnen ein Weihnachtslied beibringen. So then, our first question is, who or what is doing something, and who or what is conjugated with the verb? Richtig. Ich. It's the subject, and therefore in the nominative, which is also why it's conjugated with the modal verb möchte, whose partner infinitive verb beibringen comes in sentence final position. And now let's ask question number 2. Who or what is the subject directly acting on through the verb? Genau. The subject ich is teaching something, and here that something is ein Weihnachtslied, which means that ein Weihnachtslied is the direct object and therefore in the accusative case. And finally, we ask our third question. To whom or for whom is the subject ich teaching the direct object ein Weihnachtslied? Richtig. The nominative subject ich is teaching the accusative direct object ein Weihnachtslied to the dative indirect object, Ihnen, or in other words, to you. Und voila! With our handy set of 3 questions, we've mapped out the grammatical cases in St. Nicholas's sentence, Und jetzt möchte ich Ihnen ein Weihnachtslied beibringen. Now, let's keep going with this new grammar, shall we? But let's take it a step further. Let's get a taste of how the dative works in some real-world conversation, which can only mean, jawohl, Herr und Frau Gruber. And here's the scenario. It's Heiligabend in the Gruber's hometown of Augsburg. Ralph and Mia, though, still have a few things to buy for die Bescherung, which traditionally takes place am Heiligabend. And where is the best and the most festive place in all of Augsburg to buy last-minute presents? Der Christkindlesmarkt. So let's join Herr und Frau Gruber now at the Christkindlesmarkt as they enjoy a mug of Glühwein before they go searching for presents for the kids. Also dann, Herr und Frau Gruber, bitteschön.
Ach, ich liebe den Christkindlesmarkt. Es ist herrlich.
Ich auch. Hast du Lust auf einen Glühwein?
Gerne.
Gut, ich hol dir einen Glühwein.
Danke, aber nur einen Glühwein. Schließlich müssen wir den Kindern noch Geschenke besorgen.
Alles klar. Du suchst Geschenke und ich bringe uns 2 Glühwein. Bis gleich.
Ach, ist das nicht wunderschön? Over the years, I've been to many Christmas markets in Germany and Austria, and there are 2 things that I absolutely cannot do without when I visit one. First, a steaming mug of Glühwein, and second, a delicious bag of either heiße Maroni or gebrannte Mandeln. Lecker. In fact, I've even had the unique pleasure of introducing some of my students to Germany's magical Christmas markets. Zum Beispiel im Winter 2011. Here, we were enjoying the holiday spirit on the snow-covered streets of Rothenburg ob der Tauber. That year, I took a group of amazing students on a 2-week tour around Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. A few of the bolder students even joined me on a sledding adventure down the slopes of the Alps. Ach, das sind schöne Erinnerungen. Aber gut, let's get back to Ralph and Mia's dialogue, shall we? After all, we have some more dative to learn. Jawohl, der Dativ macht Spaß. And wouldn't you know it, whilst discussing Glühwein und Geschenke. Ralph and Mia use both nouns and personal pronouns as indirect dative objects. For example, after Mia tells Ralph that yes, indeed she would like a mug of Glühwein, he tells her, Gut, ich hole dir einen Glühwein. The nominative subject here is ich, who is getting an accusative direct object, einen Glühwein, for an indirect object, dir. What's more, the word dir is a personal pronoun, which means genau. It means that personal pronouns in German can also occur in the dative case. Ist das nicht aufregend? Now, meine Damen und Herren, do you remember the snazzy table of personal pronouns we saw in a previous lesson with the nominative and accusative forms? Well, here it is again, but this time it has a new column for the dative case. Also dann, here we go. For the first person singular, we have ich in the nominative, mich in the accusative, and mir in the dative. For the set of second person singular pronouns, we have, starting with the informal ones, du in the nominative, dich in the accusative, and dir in the dative. As for the formal pronouns, we have sie in the nominative and accusative, both with a capital S, and ihnen in the dative, also with a capital I. By the way, this is why we greet someone formally by asking them, wie geht es Ihnen? This literally means, how goes it for you? And remember, the dative case answers the question, for whom or to whom? Moving on to the third person personal pronouns. For the masculine gender, we have er in the nominative, ihn in the accusative, and ihm in the dative. The feminine pronoun is sie in the nominative and accusative, and then ihr in the dative. And the neuter pronoun is es in the nominative and accusative, and ihm in the dative. Next, we have the plural pronouns. For the first person, we have wir in the nominative, uns in the accusative, and the same in the dative, uns. Then we have the second person pronouns. For the informal set, we have ihr in the nominative and euch for the accusative and dative. For the formal second person pronouns, they're the same as the singular ones. Sie in the nominative and accusative and ihnen in the dative, all capitals. Finally, we have the third person pronouns. Remember that German does not distinguish genders in the plural series of pronouns, so we have just one row for it. In the nominative and accusative, it's sie, and in the dative, it's ihnen. Und das ist alles. We have now learned all of the personal pronouns in German. Now, as I mentioned before, Ralph and Mia's Christmas market conversation also contains examples of nouns in the dative case, nouns with definite articles preceding them. And as we've already learned, these definite articles also change in German to reflect a noun's gender, number, and case. For instance, after Ralph tells Mia, ich hole dir einen Glühwein, Mia stresses that they can only have one mug of Glühwein because schließlich müssen wir den Kindern noch Geschenke besorgen. Here, the personal pronoun wir is the nominative subject, conjugated with the modal verb müssen, which modifies the main verb besorgen. So it's we that have to get something. And the something that we have to get, the plural noun Geschenke, is the accusative direct object. As for the persons for whom we have to get the presents, well, here we see that it's den Kindern, the kids. In other words, these kids are the dative indirect object. Now, keep in mind that den Kindern is a plural noun. Mia is talking about getting gifts for the children, and not just the child, das Kind. And as we can see here, the plural definite article for nouns in the dative is den Kindern. Yes, I realize that this den looks like another definite article that we've learned already, namely the singular masculine accusative article den. But believe me, the two are not the same grammatically. The one you use before a masculine singular noun in the accusative. The other you use before a plural noun in the dative. Verstanden? To help you visualize all this, let's roll out another super-duper handy-dandy table, shall we? This one is for the definite articles. Working top to bottom, let's start with the masculine articles. In the nominative, we have der, which goes to den in the accusative, and to dem in the dative. The feminine definite article in the nominative is die, which stays die in the accusative, but which goes to der in the dative. Next, we have the neuter definite articles. In the nominative and accusative, it's das, and in the dative, it becomes dem. Finally, we have the plural definite articles. In the nominative and accusative cases, it's die, and in the dative, it goes to den plus an extra in suffix that we add to the noun or nouns modified by that article. Remember that Mia says, schließlich müssen wir den Kindern noch Geschenke besorgen. Now, the nominative and accusative plural forms of the children is die Kinder. But when a noun occurs in the plural form in dative, that plural noun takes an extra in at the end. So while we would say, die Kinder sind brav, which I hope all kids are, die Kinder here is the subject. Now when I say, ich sehe die Kinder, the Kinder here are the direct object. They're what we see. But when we say, ich kaufe den Kindern neue Kleidung, with den Kindern as the indirect object, because they are the for whom that the ich is buying new clothes. You get it? In fact, it works this way for most plural nouns in the dative case. For instance, if you're a Hundefreund, like me, well, you might say, ich liebe meine Hunde. Here, the plural noun Hunde is an accusative direct object, die Hunde. But if you make this plural noun into a dative indirect object, well, it needs the extra in suffix, as in, ich gebe meinen Hunden Knochen. Now, there is one exception to this extra in on the end of plural nouns in the dative case rule. Nouns that take an S in their plural form usually don't get that extra in when they're in the dative. For instance, the nominative and accusative plural forms of the noun der Popstar is die Popstars. So imagine that we're at a Backstreet Boys comeback concert. When they come out on stage, we would probably scream something like, ach mein Gott, ich sehe die Popstars. And then imagine that we get a bit carried away with our affection for their music, and so we decide to rush up on the stage. And before security tactfully and professionally removes us from the scene, we manage to give two of the pop stars a kiss on the cheek. Well, later that night, we would brag to our friends, ich habe den Popstars einen Kuss gegeben. We don't need an in on the dative plural noun, den Popstars. Alles klar? Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, that will have to do it for this, die 17. Lektion. But be sure to tune in for die 18. Lektion, in which we'll once again be joining Ralph and Mia Gruber as they explore two more fascinating locations in the German-speaking world. This time, we'll be heading to die Schweiz. Jawohl! The city of Zürich and the town of Zermatt await. Auf Wiedersehen und bis gleich.